Welcome to today's lecture of American legislative process. I hope that today finds all of you guys happy and healthy, and most importantly, healthy, I guess, and kind of settling into a new routine as this reboot of our spring 2020 semester commences. So I know things are still really up in the air, obviously, in terms of school and kind of nationwide. But I hope that all of you are able to get into a routine sooner rather than later when it comes to your classes. One thing that I think would be helpful is, or maybe you're not interested, but anyway, I think it's helpful, is to give you sort of a daily update as to what my day looks like. So I'm still here at my house in Dallas and spent the majority of my day, except briefly when my kids were taking a nap this afternoon, but I spent the majority of my day sort of chasing them around. And really fortunate to have a backyard that my kids can play in, and thankfully the weather was beautiful today. And I'm recording this, by the way, on Tuesday night. And but anyway, the weather was great, and they were able to spend some time outside, so I'm really grateful for that. And also, we drove to my parents' house, and they stood in their front yard, and my kids stuck their heads out of the sunroof of my car and were able to talk to their grandparents for about 20 minutes, which was a real treat. And just grateful that everybody's healthy, and I hope that today finds you in the same boat. So on tap for today, we're going to talk about committees, which are truly the workhorse of Congress. And it's maybe not the sexiest topic, which is why I had to put an exclamation point there to get you excited about it. So we're going to cover the basics, right? What they are, why does Congress have them, how have they evolved over time, different types of committees, and how do we, and by we I mean leadership in Congress, decide who serves on which committee. So today is going to be a sort of primer on Committees 101. So a congressional committee, and it's hard to believe that this is a course about Congress and we've waited now until the end of March to talk about committees because they're such an important part of how Congress does its business. But a congressional committee, for our purposes, is a legislative sub-organization in the US Congress that handles a specific duty rather than the general duties of Congress. Um, and here the sort of two Congresses concept really comes into play. And we'll talk about how senators feel, and representatives for that matter, feel allegiance to their committees. But it's important to remember that not only is a member of Congress a representative of a specific geographic collection of people, and also a lawmaker for an entire nation, but they are also a member of at least one, often, in almost all cases, more than one committee that deals with a specific policy area for the whole nation, right? So it's almost like another constituency. Let's say somebody's on the Agriculture Committee in the Senate. In some weird way, they probably feel like a farmer in California is their constituent, just like a farmer in their home state of Iowa is their constituent, right? So you get these sort of overlapping um, and kind of cross-state constituencies with respect to committees, and I find it to be a really interesting phenomenon. So there are approximately 200 committees and subcommittees split between both the House and the Senate. The majority of these are subcommittees, but there are a lot of committees as well. Again, I'm not really big on memorization, so I don't really care if you've like memorized the whole list. That's not really what this is about. I am far more interested, as you might imagine, in you understanding sort of theoretically and practically what it is that committees do. And here is a good place, I think, to go back to something we talked about at the beginning of the semester, which is focus on the verbs. So in this case, committees are gatherers of information. They compare and evaluate legislative alternatives. They identify policy problems. And of course, they propose solutions. Committees serve two functions, and I covered this the other day, but they serve two functions within both the House and the Senate. They serve an individual function, which means that lawmakers, of course, can use committee assignments to benefit their constituents. So they can put pork dollars towards their district or towards their state. They can, of course, represent the interest of farmers if they're on the agricultural committee. So there are a lot of things that lawmakers can do as individuals to strengthen their position within the institution of Congress and within sort of their standing among their constituents. And this, of course, plays right into David Mayhew and Richard Fenno's reelection goal. And secondly, committees have an institutional function as well, and they can act as what congressional scholars have referred to as institutional safety valves, meaning they give sort of a space for members of Congress to vent, right? And whether they are releasing steam through an act of voting or through determining what's on an agenda, it gives them a place. It basically provides a place for pressure within the system to be released. There are also, of course, forums for debate. There are forums for controversies. Just take a look at the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, for example, during the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh a couple of years ago. They can help to vent, they can absorb, and they can even sometimes resolve pressing policy and political concerns. They also give citizens a greater sense of participation in national decision making, and they can educate members about public problems through holding testimony or allowing citizens to come forth and address the committee. And they also serve sort of a reverse function as well, right? Which is that individual function, allowing individual constituents to feel better represented by their members of Congress. So why do we have committees? I covered these sort of briefly the other night or the other day, but I think it's worth going through them again. So there are three sort of explanations, and it's possible that all three of them are true. It's just different ways to think about the same topic, which of course are committees. So this first way is what we call the distributive theory, then the informational theory, and partisan. Let's go through them one by one. So distributive theory suggests that in sort of a distributive view of politics, hopefully those of you who took law, politics, and public policy with me last semester remember that term. But a distributive view of politics comes from this political scientist named Harold Lasswell, who was very influential, and his definition of politics was who gets what, when, and how. So you can think of politics as like goods that somebody is distributing, right? So political Santa is passing out presents. And in this way, you can think of a committee assignment as like a political present, right? So committees are created to give lawmakers policy influence in areas that are very, very important to their reelection. And self-selection here, of course, leads to preference outliers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The second theory that committees are sort of rooted in is what we call informational theory. And committees give lawmakers specialized expertise to make judgments that are rooted in fact to address a complex and really ever-changing world. And this gets really to the heart of Polsby's institutionalization argument in the House of Representatives. And of course, one of his tenets of institutionalization is that a body, as it institutionalizes, begins to divide its labor. And Congress is no exception. And what the committee system does is allow senators and members of the House, and the House is even more specialized than the Senate, to really gather some institutional and policy expertise to make some important judgments. So, for example, Joe Biden, when he was in the Senate, served for many, many, many years on two committees, the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Judiciary Committee, and really developed, at least among his peers, a reputation for having expertise in both of those areas. And so the goal in this informational theory of committees is to formulate policies that resolve national problems. The third explanation for why we have committees and what function they serve is rooted in partisanship. And here, committees are simply the agents of the political parties. I talked about this the other night, but in a principal agent relationship, the principal controls the actions of the agent. And in this sense, committees are simply um, arms of the party, right? So, as a member of the Republican Party, yeah, you may also be on the Judiciary Committee, but you're a Republican first. This has not always been the case, although now, in our increasingly partisan and gridlocked and sort of highly polarized Congress, it is more the case now than ever before. Or not ever before, but at least recently. So, how have committees evolved? In early Congresses, committees were very temporary panels, and hopefully you remember this from our Polsby discussion, but proposals in early Congress were first considered on the floor, and then they were referred to committees to work out the details after. And the system today looks a little bit different. In fact, it's often the reverse of this. So by 1816, the Senate and the House, although it happened a little bit later in the House, had developed what we call standing committees. And these were really better in many ways than ad hoc groups to cope with congressional business. If you're unfamiliar with the phrase ad hoc, it means sort of created each time anew, right? And so a standing committee is the opposite of that. It's something that is always there. And why do you think that's the case? Well, early practitioners and early members of Congress, it did not take long for them to realize that there were policy areas within American politics, like education, for example, although that came much later, but defense, dealing with the courts. There were these policy areas that weren't ever going to go away. It's not like we were ever going to solve the courts. It's not like we're ever going to solve education or how much money to allocate to the defense of the United States or how much money to subsidize farmers or whatever it is. These problems are never going to be solved. It's just simply we are dealing with them all the time, right? And so if we're dealing with them all the time, then it certainly makes sense for a committee to be established that deals with these problems all the time rather than, hey, wow, it's time to pass another farm bill. Well, we passed a farm bill 5 years ago and another one 5 years before that, another one 5 years before that. Why are we inventing the wheel each time? Let's get a committee, standing committee in agriculture, to deal with this on the regular. So speaking of standing committees, there are first type of committee, and I'll go through several here. But a standing committee is permanent, and it is created either by the public or by House and Senate rules. And the key point of a standing committee, really the one thing that you need to remember, or you need to remember a couple things, but they continue from Congress to Congress, right? So it's not like if we elect Congress in November, they take office in January, they come in and they're like, okay, what issues should our committees address? And someone raises their hand and says, what about housing? No. Like there already is a committee for that, right? These committees exist from Congress to Congress, regardless of who it is that fills them. They are the workhorse of congressional committees. They are always there, and they are where much of the action in Congress takes place. We also have subcommittees, which handle a lot of the sort of day-to-day lawmaking and oversight work of Congress. And they're created to sometimes break down what are very, very complex policy areas into manageable pieces. And I'll talk through some specific examples of this later. Joint committees are our third type of committee. They've been used since the first Congress, and they include members from both chambers. There are actually four of them. There's the Economic Joint Committee, the Library Joint Committee, the Printing Joint Committee, and the Taxation Committee. There are select committees, which are temporary. They have a 2-year shelf life, so in other words, they last the same duration as any given Congress, and they're usually tasked with studying, investigating, and making recommendations. And we can have there can be select committees for a lot of reasons. They can serve as a vent, right? So if, for example, Republicans are pushing against increased gun control measures, but they want it to look like they're doing something, then they can put together a standing committee on gun violence, for example, The idea may be, look, that standing committee is not going to actually do anything. They may make a report, they may investigate, they may make recommendations, but at the end of the day, we're simply throwing a bone to the more moderate members of our party. Um, Yet they can also be really an access point for interest groups, so they could allow interest groups to get into the policymaking process and actually make some real changes. They could also allow for the investigation of issues which permanent panels can lack the time or interest in doing. And then finally, there are conference committees, which are temporary panels, and they reconcile differences between similar measures that are, of course, are passed by both chambers. Um, People are sort of split, people who study Congress, rather, are sort of split as to how influential these committees actually are. Some think of them as simply a rubber stamp. But in other cases, it's really been clear that conference committees have played a large role in crafting the final version of bills. And of course, they have complete unilateral authority at a very late stage of the policy creation process. We'll talk much more about the sort of temporal or time-based importance of the various steps of the policymaking process a little bit later in the semester, but that does play an important role. Assignment to the most important committees in Congress is very exclusive. So, for example, if a Democrat in the House of Representatives serves on the Appropriations Committee, which is arguably the first or second most important committee in the House after Ways and Means, then they can serve on no other standing committees. So that is truly kind of a star-making committee. So the pecking order is Ways and Means and Appropriations in the House. Finance is a really big deal in the Senate. They deal with all tax, trade, Social Security, and Medicare measures. House and Senate Appropriations Committees are very desirable, of course, although this desirability has lessened since there's been an increased push to limit earmark spending, which is where lawmakers would shove special projects into bills that didn't have anything to do with those projects. And so if you were on the Appropriations Committee, like Senator Robert Byrd, late senator from West Virginia, who was famous for funneling federal dollars toward his home state of West Virginia. Oops, sorry, this is a repeat slide, so we'll get through it here. Except for this new bullet point, which is there's a real norm of naming junior members of Congress to committees where they can raise a lot of cash, and they come in contact with deep-pocketed potential either industries or donors. So like the Commerce Committee in the Senate, financial services, they deal with banking, etc. So how do lawmakers choose kind of which committees are preferential, and how do they politic for committees? So, of course, Fenno, right, our old buddy Richard Fenno, argued that lawmakers have three goals, right? So the first, of course, is reelection. You can't do anything unless you're reelected. The second is influence within the House. And the third is good policy. And that really all three of these things affect the committee memberships that are sought by members of Congress. So, for example, members who are very oriented toward reelection, so early in their career, were attracted to committees that dealt with resources, and specifically resources that then these members could funnel back to their districts. Influence-oriented members, those who wanted influence within the body itself, were attracted to Ways and Means and to appropriations because, of course, other members of the House have to come to you if they want their projects to be funded. And then finally, policy-oriented members tended to be attracted to education, labor, foreign affairs, right? These are committees where having deep and substantive policy experience and expertise is quite helpful. So sometimes members of Congress are punished. For example, the very influential African-American female Democrat Shirley Chisholm represented a district in the 1970s, 1980s in Brooklyn, New York, was assigned to the Agriculture Committee. And even if you've never been to Brooklyn, I don't think it's too much of a stretch of your imagination to realize that not much agriculture is happening in Brooklyn. which, if it were its own city, by the way, would be the fourth biggest city in the United States after New York, uh, LA, and Chicago. Brooklyn as a borough is bigger than Houston. All right. So there are a couple different criteria, then formal criteria, for how a member of Congress gets placed on a committee. So formally, for both parties, the committee assignments don't necessarily need to follow seniority. Yet each party has some individual rules. So the Republicans in the Senate argue that two Republicans from the same state can't serve on the same committee. So that's an internal rule that they have. So, for example, John Cornyn and Ted Cruz from Texas could not serve on the same committee. Lyndon Johnson instituted a rule for the Democrats in the 1950s when he was a majority leader that said that all Democrats are assigned to a major committee in the Senate before a member is assigned to a second major committee. Informally, there is so much at play here when determining who gets which committee assignment. So party loyalty is one thing, geography is another, substantive expertise, gender, electoral vulnerability. There is the property norm, which is that the committee assignment panels of each party typically really respect this norm. And it says that returning lawmakers, so if you're reelected, you're permitted to retain your same committee seat unless you're bumped because of ratio changes. And what I mean by a ratio change is, so committee membership, let's say the Judiciary Committee has 13 members, and the Democrats have the majority, let's say in the Senate. So there may be 7 Democrats on the committee and 6 Republicans. So if an election happens and Republicans retake the majority and those numbers switch, so now Republicans hold 7 seats in the committee and Democrats 6, then of course one Democrat has to be bumped. So it's often a junior Democrat. It may be somebody who actually lost their re-election bid anyway, and so they're bumped no matter what. But there are some examples in particular of politicians from vulnerable states who are given very plum committee assignments. We talked about this early in the semester, but if Beto O'Rourke had won his Senate race against Ted Cruz in Texas in 2018, he would have had his choice of committee assignments. And the reason why is because Democrats, it's in their vested interest to prop up their electorally vulnerable candidates in every possible way, right? So that's great if you're somebody like Beto O'Rourke and you're elected to the Senate, or Doug Jones in Alabama, or Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who served on the Appropriations Committee, or Claire McCaskill, who did serve on the Finance Committee. She actually lost her re-election bid in 2018. But it's not so good if you're from a safe Democrat state, right? Like Kamala Harris or Dianne Feinstein, who, of course, actually has a lot of seniority, so she's on very powerful committees. But if you're from a safe Democratic state, there's not much of an impetus for party leadership to put you on an influential committee, because they don't have to worry about you being a vulnerable or sort of in a vulnerable place. Political future, sort of the goals of politicians, future goals of politicians also play a role here. So Cory Booker, for example, Democrat from New Jersey, it was well known that he had presidential aspirations. He's a former mayor of Newark, New Jersey. So when you're the mayor of Newark, you don't often have an ability to develop foreign policy expertise. So he was put on the Foreign Relations Committee to sort of buttress his foreign policy knowledge. Same with Elizabeth Warren, who was put on the Armed Services Committee. She had, of course, a reputation as a progressive senator from Massachusetts, and it was thought that if she was going to run for president, which of course she did, she would be well served by having some interactions with veterans and with the America's Armed Forces on her resume. And then finally, the criteria of seniority has to be discussed. So Senate Republicans apply seniority super rigidly. And like anything else with seniority, if you're junior, you think it sucks. And if you're senior, you think it's great. So I liked this quote. When I first came to the Senate, I was very skeptical of the seniority tradition. But as I've become more senior, I've grown more fond of it. And of course, that's the case. Yet backbenchers and younger members of Congress often chafe against these requirements. So, in January of 2015, for example, younger House Democrats wanted to impose a 6 year limit on how long a member could serve as chair or a ranking member of a committee. House and Senate Republicans already have this, though they sometimes grant waivers. And there are good reasons why you may want some sort of fresh blood in either the chair position, which of course is the person who's in charge of the committee, or the ranking member, which is the most senior member of the minority party. Obviously, expertise changes, knowledge level can change, the world can sometimes pass these representatives or senators by. But alternatively, it does also make some sense to keep people in these positions for a long time because committees, as we've already discussed, give members of Congress the ability to develop some sort of substantive expertise. So, speaking of committee chairs, they do a lot of things, but most importantly, they set the agenda for the committee. So, for example, a chair can kill a bill by simply never scheduling it for a hearing. They are also among the most strategically and substantively knowledgeable members of both the House and the Senate. Ranking minority members are placed in a reactive position where they have to address the plans of the majority. They're very rarely in an agenda setting position, although you might be surprised to realize that many ranking minority members who are currently in that position in the House and the Senate were once committee chairs, right? And just their party, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, lost their majority, or vice versa. They were a ranking minority member for a number of years, and then their party gained the majority, and then all of a sudden they're in charge. So, despite the fact that committees are this sort of necessary subunit of lawmaking and seemingly a good thing for the policymaking process, they sometimes break. And this, of course, is a picture of two Californians, Adam Schiff, who is a Democrat representing Los Angeles, and of course Devin Nunes, who is a Republican representing the Central Valley. And they both served on the House Intelligence Committee. In fact, they both served, Adam Schiff was the chair, and Devin Nunes was the ranking minority member. And this committee, of course, was tasked with overseeing Russian efforts to hack, whatever phrase you want to say, the 2016 presidential election. And they despise one another. So each released confidential memos to the press slamming the other. Bipartisanship completely disappeared from the committee. And there was a funny example of Republicans. So committees actually have suites of offices, right? So you walk through a big door, then there's be like six little individual offices, almost like a suite style dorm. And Republicans in their office suite literally built a wall to separate GOP staffers from Democratic staffers. And I like this quote from Mike Conaway, who's a Republican from Texas. And he said, "Some Republican members said that they were unaware of plans for the wall. I'm not part of that decision. You've got to talk to Devin." And so as a result, this really important work that the House Intelligence Committee is tasked with doing kind of devolves into just partisan bickering. Yet, despite the negativity from the Intelligence Committee, committee policymaking for the most part tends to be pretty deliberate, pretty collegial, and pretty strategic. And of course, committees have overlapping jurisdictions, which can lead to the collegiality and the increase in strategic thinking. Because if you're often not the only king in the castle, right? So you've got to pursue relationships on the other side. So, for example, just surface transportation in the United States is dealt with by Commerce, Science, Transportation Committee. They all handle railroads, buses, trucks, and highway safety. The Environment and Public Works Committee deals with highway construction and maintenance. The Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee is responsible for mass transit. Finance is responsible for fuel taxes. And the Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation is responsible for spending. So if you just look at this one policy area, right, which is how do we design roads and railways and whatever in America, look at all of the committees that policy-making process is going to go through. So there are some effects of this overlapping jurisdictional situation. There are some positives, which means that members can develop expertise in several fields. It also tends to keep one group of lawmakers from dominating a topic, and it tends to promote healthy competition among committees, right? So a committee may be sort of eager to be the one that discharges a bill, for example. On the negative side, it can also lead to inter-committee warfare, particularly on issues that really don't fit neatly into boxes like the environment or cybersecurity, which are kind of cross issue and can be tricky to deal with. And finally, formal jurisdictions just simply have not kept pace with change in policy areas like climate change, for example. Um, so that is the end of tonight's slideshow. We'll talk a little bit more about committees next week, but I wanted to mention a few things about the paper first. So I covered this on Monday, but I just want to reiterate that I am not looking for you to defend a thesis in this paper. Okay, what I want is the sense that A, you've picked a bill, B, you can tell me what it's about, and C, you can tell me generally how it was passed and under what conditions, right? So what committees did it go through? Who was president? Who was co-sponsor? Who was sponsor? Whose idea was the bill? What policy area was it attempting to address? All of these sort of basics, all right? The idea is that you accumulate knowledge about the passage process, which will then allow you to determine later in the final paper whether it was passed via unorthodox lawmaking or not. Do not make that determination in this paper because you simply do not have enough information to do so yet. All right, that means that you do not need to have a thesis statement. We'll talk more about how to think about the thesis statement as paper assignment number 2 approaches, which is essentially a literature review. It's an annotated bibliography where you're looking at sources that will hopefully support or refute your thesis. And if too many sources end up refuting your thesis, then that's maybe a good indicator that you should switch your thesis around from one way to the other. But we'll talk more about that later. So I, of course, will be available by email Wednesday, Thursday, and most of the day Friday. I'm quarantined at my house, although voluntarily. Haven't been exposed or anything to coronavirus as far as I know, but we're not going anywhere. So I will be here and we'll be checking emails periodically throughout the day and then, of course, at night. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And also feel free to post in that open thread on the discussion forum. I miss seeing y'all in person, and I love to hear from you in sort of multiple different ways. So feel free to give us an update. But for now, that's all I've got. So stay safe, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.